Thank you so much for watching the Thom Hartmann Program, our program here on Free Speech TV. We really appreciate it. The main way that we support our program, that all of us who work here get our paychecks and that we keep the lights on and whatnot here. Free Speech TV does that by asking you to donate, a couple times a year, and that keeps Free Speech TV alive. We keep our show alive principally, mostly, by advertising. We have advertisers who pay the bills. They support the program. And we've told you about some of them in the past, but really want to just move all that onto the internet. So if you would like to support our program by supporting our underwriters, our advertisers, you can go to thomhartmann.com. There's a complete list of them, or there will be soon, and just click on their little ads and find out what they have and be there for them and for us. Thank you so much. Our book for today is Kickback, Exposing the Global Corporate Bribery Network by David Montero. This is from the introduction, Chapter 1. During Watergate, the appointment of a special prosecutor to investigate Richard Nixon's alleged tampering with elections was intended to mark the close of a sordid chapter in American history. Instead, that effort, culminating in Nixon's resignation, would prove to be only the beginning of a deeper political morass that America would face for decades to come. Congressional investigations would uncover for the first time that multinational corporations, through slush funds and bribes, were not only secretly funding political organizations at home, like Nixon's re-election campaign, but corrupting foreign officials abroad. This new perspective on the corporate abuse of power and its impact overseas would result in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FPCA, groundbreaking legislation that, by prohibiting commercial bribery for the first time in history, sought to change how capitalism and political affairs were conducted all around the world. Now, more than 40 years later, we are experiencing a kind of déjà vu as the special counsel investigates whether the president allegedly abused his power, again by obstructing an inquiry into a possible manipulation of our country's elections. Just as was the case in Watergate, whatever special counsel Robert Mueller uncovers will likely mark the beginning, rather than the end, of a reassessment of how power actually operates in this country. And just as in Watergate, there's the possibility that Mueller's far-reaching probe may reveal how tightly political corruption and corporate corruption are linked through bribery, just under the surface of America's political life. Nixon was the recipient of secret corporate donations, which were considered illegal because they should have been disclosed. But the payments, while unlawful, did not compromise the presidential election itself. Mueller's Russian inquiry is directed at a potentially far more serious crime, whether Donald Trump, the head of a sprawling business empire, colluded with a foreign power to deliberately sway the American electorate, committing the very crime that the FCPA had been trying to eradicate since Watergate. The offer of a foreign bribe, a kickback. That law specifically states that a corporate bribe need not involve an actual exchange of money. An offer of anything of value, such as a promise to a foreign government official, is sufficient to violate its terms. This is precisely what Mueller is trying to ascertain, whether Trump, his company, his associates, or his family, or some combination of them, offered a promise to Russian government officials, a quid pro quo. If they helped Trump by manipulating the elections, Trump, if victorious, would ease U.S. sanctions against Russia. Doing so would allow greater U.S. investment of Russia and would benefit Russian officials and oligarchs, the Trump Business Organization, the corporate interests of the Trump family, and former members of his senior staff, including Paul Manafort, his one-time campaign chairman, and Michael Flynn, his disgraced national security advisor. If the Trump Organization or anyone connected with it did make such a promise, and depending on how that promise was conveyed to Russian officials, the Justice Department would have strong grounds for pursuing an FCPA charge, among others. An FCPA violation is within Mueller's mandate to investigate, quote, any matters that arose or may arise directly from this investigation. As has been widely observed, Mueller has hired 2 former federal law enforcement officials with extensive experience in investigating fraud, money laundering, and overseas bribery. Andrew Weissman, who ran the Justice Department's fraud section, which enforces the FCPA, and Greg Andres, who helped oversee FCPA policy in the criminal division. The drama playing out in Washington starkly highlights the fact that foreign corporate bribery can be a deeply misleading term. We've come to regard it, when we think of it at all, as something that unscrupulous companies do in distant countries, so that any impact it has must be contained overseas. If a corporation pays kickbacks to a greedy government official abroad, why should we be concerned? But in a highly interconnected world, bound together by a global market, a global financial system, and the constant migration of peoples, goods, capital, corruption rarely stays out there. Bribes eventually harm Americans, American society, American values, and American interests, both domestically and around the world, in ways that are difficult to gauge. Why do firms resort to bribery? The obvious reason is to gain an advantage over their competitors. But illicit payments also buy the illusion of growth in the short term, of increased market share and inflated firm value. It does not take into account the harm that this practice causes to companies themselves: sinking employee morale, diminished profit margins, and the possibility of hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and penalties, not to mention a reputation that will be associated with corruption and deceit. They also effectively steal the public's money, because the majority of bribery cases involve capital-intensive development in infrastructure projects such as roads, dams, defense systems, oil extraction, or mining that are publicly funded. To recoup the bribes involved in winning such contracts, companies conspire with foreign officials to inflate the costs, sometimes by 10 or even hundreds of millions of dollars. While the companies and the officials win out, taxpayers are left shouldering the burden. Corporate bribes involve a remarkable amount of money. The World Bank has estimated $1 trillion a year, although this may represent the high end. Others have placed the market at 10% of the $4 trillion spent annually on global public procurement. The book Kickback by David Montero.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice. Believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. It is Wednesday. It's the first hour of our Wednesday program, and that means it's time for Middays with Mark. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. Our telephone number, 202-808-9925. And Congressman, welcome back to the program.
Well, thanks, Tom. Glad to be here.
Always great having you with us. I should add, your website is pocan.house.gov, and people can tweet you at Rep. Mark Pocan. I noticed that a number of Democrats are calling on Ajit Pai, the former Verizon lawyer who now runs the FCC, who lied to Congress, according to press reports, about when they had an open comment period. Literally millions of Americans went to the FCC's website to say, don't take down net neutrality. And they blocked or ignored all of those postings, or the majority of those postings, and then said, nobody cares, so we're going to get rid of net neutrality. Do you know where this is going in Congress? Is there going to be a serious effort to hold this guy accountable for this crime?
I think most of the effort, at least on the House side right now, is to try to get the disagreeing with their decision resolution through. The Senate passed it, so it's already through the Senate. If we can pass it in the House, we could try to overturn that decision. So we have a discharge petition trying to do that, to have the resolution disapproval. Problem is we need Republicans. We haven't had a lot of Republicans sign on yet, but I think that's part of the campaign we're doing, because while there could be hearings, again, it's hard to, when the Republicans are in control of the House and the Senate, to have those be effective. Certainly, if we can outright get a vote that has disapproval of that, we could perhaps overturn that decision. So I think that's where, in the House anyway, more of our focus has been on trying to get the signatures we need to force a vote.
The Republicans, in one of their first legislative actions, I believe, maybe it was an executive action, but I think it was legislation, was to allow coal mines to dump more waste and poison into our rivers, which end up as our drinking water. They have been absolutely dancing to the tune of the fossil fuel billionaires who claim that there's no such thing as global warming. You have one Republican who has signed on to the discharge petition asking Paul Ryan to allow a vote on this resolution of disapproval that would overturn what Ajit Pai did with the internet. Is there I mean, it's so obvious, I think, to most Americans that the Republicans are insanely corrupt, and that the type of corruption that they're acting out is purely being bought and paid for by whoever writes the largest check, whichever industry, whether it's polluting coal or polluting oil or the the big internet service providers. Who want their monopolies and whatnot. I mean, I find it bizarre, for example, that one of them is advertising on TV. You can have this price for life. I mean, in a true competitive market, what happens over time is prices go down. Nobody would want a price for life, right? I mean, this is nuts. Do your Republican colleagues think of themselves as corrupt, or is it just like, hey, go to Congress and get rich? Or is there some rationale or story that they tell themselves that makes this acceptable to them? I'm baffled by this.
Well, I think there's two ways of looking at it. One, there's the more normal levels of corruption, which is the undue influence by special interests via lobbyists, right? So something like the decision that happened around net neutrality. Clearly, it's in the best interest of only the big telecom companies and nobody else, no small business, no individual, no consumer. So that's kind of the standard garden variety corruption. And then we've got the renewed level of corruption that's been brought in by the Trump administration, which is this, having your staff find your wife a job, getting you a used mattress from the Trump hotel, demanding expensive goods in their offices because they feel they're worth it, flying first class. There's that level. So one of the themes, I think, looking at November is what you just said, Tom, is just corruption, period. Whether it be the more garden variety, which people are tired of, which is why people are tired of corporations and the money they put into campaigns. And then part of it is the new level of corruption that when Donald Trump said he was going to drain the swamp, instead he just dredged it bigger and built a high-rise luxury condo on it. And that's, the problem I think that people are now seeing. When we pulled this issue, the Progressive Caucus in competitive congressional districts, when you talk about the swamp, and that includes big banks and big corporations, it gets even stronger, the opposition to what's happening. So people are with us on this, and I think it is one of the themes that we're going into November on.
That's great. And finally, before we pick up calls this morning, you had primaries in your state yesterday. What's your read on the outcome of the primaries? I mean, they were in, I believe, 4 states altogether. What's your take on what happened?
What a great day we had for progressives. So Vermont, the first transgender gubernatorial candidate, and Christine Hallquist. In Connecticut, the progressive won the primary for the congressional seat, Johanna Hayes, Teacher of the Year. She'll be the first African-American female from Connecticut serving in Congress if she wins in November. In Minnesota, we had a bunch of good news. There's a number of congressional races, including, I think, one that listeners would be interested in, Ilhan Omar, who won the Keith Ellison seat, who is a strong progressive in the Minnesota legislature. And then in Wisconsin, Randy Bryce, officially now, as we expected, won his primary, and now he is going to be the Democratic nominee running in the congressional seat that Paul Ryan vacated. A lot of activity. And then also our governor's race, we have a real shot at beating Scott Walker. Tony Evers is our state superintendent of schools. Won an 8-way primary with 40% of the vote, 42%, so won decidedly. And we've got a great candidate for Attorney General in Josh Kaul. We've had a rather ethically challenged and somewhat incompetent Republican Attorney General. So there's a lot of cool activity happening, and we had great primary turnouts. And the last thing I think I'd say is, just to give you an idea, again, on turnout intensity, in Wisconsin, about $1.25 million was spent cumulatively by all of our gubernatorial candidates, and over $30 million with outside money on the Republican primary for the U.S. Senate. And we had 85,000, last time I looked, more Democratic votes than Republican votes in Wisconsin yesterday in the primary, despite that huge imbalance on spending.
Wow. That is substantial. I'm curious your take on the media mantra. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was elected, it was like, oh, there's a progressive wave happening, and then when not all of the candidates that she and Bernie endorsed won their primaries, it was the new media narrative seems to be, oh, there's no progressive wave. What's your sense of what's real here?
I think they should go back to their last set of articles. There's a progressive wave. All the races I just mentioned wouldn't have happened had it not been for a progressive wave again. And so we saw that in the upper Midwest, an area that went more for Trump than other parts of the country 2 years ago. In Wisconsin, there was a poll recently in the last couple of weeks. Trump's approval rating was 36% in Wisconsin, and only 31% want him to run for re-election. So even 5% of the people who think he's doing a good job don't really want him around anymore. So I would still argue that we're seeing this really strong progressive base turnout coming out, and ultimately, because we're going to have a good November, that means a lot of progressives are going to get elected.
Wonderful. We've got callers on the line literally from coast to coast. We'll pick them up right after the break. It is Middays with Mark here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Congressman Mark Pocan, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, representing the great state of Wisconsin, taking your calls for the hour right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
You can check out Congressman Pocan's website at pocan.house.gov. His Twitter handle is Rep. Mark, M-A-R-K, Pocan, P-O-C-A-N. And welcome back. Jared in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, you are on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hello, Tom, and hello, Congressman Pocan. I'm calling today about the recent Saudi bombing of a school bus, killing 51 people, and at least 40 of them were children. I'm asking today, why is it that we have not established a no-fly zone over Saudi Arabia? If we've established a no-fly zone over Libya for far less than this.
You mean over Yemen, don't you?
We are seeing. What was that?
You said, why don't we establish one over Saudi Arabia? Don't you mean Yemen?
No. Over Saudi. Oh, no, that too. Yeah. Over Saudi Arabia, because they're bombing hospitals. They're bombing weddings. They are committing what the UN has called the largest humanitarian catastrophe in the world right now. It's been estimated that more people will starve in Yemen today than people who died during the Holocaust. And we're making people mad at us because there are weapons. We are fueling and arming the Saudi bombers who are going out into Yemen, who are dropping these bombs and advising them where to target. My question is, what are we going to do about this? Why has this Holocaust not ended yet?
Jared, great question. You know, I have worked closely with people like Ro Khanna from California, Adam Smith most recently from Washington State, who is the ranking member on one of the committees that relates directly to our nation's defense. Steny Hoyer recently joined us in doing a letter around Yemen. And I think the good news I can offer is, you know, it went from almost no attention to we're actually getting attention. In the Senate, Bernie Sanders was able to try to get a vote. Unfortunately, he ran a few votes short. In the House, we are trying to do the same thing to try to force some action. But the good news, at least, is that there is growing attention to what you described very well, an area that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention given the calamity that's happening. The bad news is the Trump administration, I think, if I remember right, the very first country Donald Trump went to when he became president was Saudi Arabia. Yep. When most presidents go to Canada, you know, he went where the money is and where his business interests are, and there is a closeness there that we certainly have to fight because we are helping in the refueling of Saudi jets. We are providing other logistical help in what's going on in Yemen, and yet we've often been lied to by folks in the military about this as we've asked questions. So it definitely needs more attention. We're having some progress, but we certainly have to fight against the Trump administration.
We have 28 seconds to the break, Congressman. Do you see this? Let me rephrase that. Are you getting a lot of feedback about this issue from your constituents, or because this is something that is very, very rarely covered by our national news, it's also very rarely brought up by your constituents?
Yes, that's part of the problem. Is we are now getting more and more attention, and we're starting to get more Twitter traffic, etc., on the issue. But part of it is educational. I think if you ask the average person, much less the average member of Congress, where Yemen is, they would probably not get very close on the map to finding it.
Yeah, amen. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment. Stick around. It's coming up on 20 minutes past the hour. Congressman Mark Pocan on the line taking your calls for the hour. It's Middays with Mark on the Thom Hartmann Program. And Dave in Pittsburgh, California, you are on the air with Congressman Mark Pocan.
Yeah, Mark Pocan, I have a question for you. The provisional ballots, who regulates those? And is it a state regulation or a federal regulation, or is it a law passed by the Congress? Who regulates it, and is there a way to petition to remove the provisional ballots completely out of the voting tree and just not ever use the provisional ballot, because we know that they don't get counted? So it's a moot issue when you go to vote if somebody hands you a provisional ballot. Is there any way that a law can be passed, or does the state, or do we have to petition the state to eliminate those provisional ballots? And I'll take your answer on the air. Thank you.
Yeah, Dave, thank you. That is a good question. I wish I could give you this is the definitive answer. I believe it crosses a few different jurisdictions because often states have a little bit more control over that level. But I believe, if I remember right, there was some direct creation of the provisional ballots following the Bush versus Gore election.
It's in the Help America Vote Act. That's where it started in 2002.
Think the implementation is done at the state level, but I could be wrong. There could be a local level jurisdiction. But we just saw, for example, in New Hampshire, they were going to toss out votes over some bad signatures. That was ruled unconstitutional. So a lot of that oversight happens at the state level, and I know in my state, we, for example, recently did a photo ID law that matches what a lot of other states have, but fortunately we still have a same-day registration law that not other states have. So I think it's probably more at your state level and the direct day-to-day supervision of that, but we've got lots of battles when it comes to election law, and the good news is the Democrats have taken the reform as a big issue going into, if we take the majority, things that we're going to move forward around campaign finance and electoral reform will be at the very top of our agenda, and I think in the first 90 days you'll see bills move.
I think one of the big problems that Dave was identifying is that if you've been purged from the ballots, I mean, we're seeing, for example, in Florida, Democratic registration is down 2% just in 16 months. And it should be up because there's just this explosion of interest in Democratic candidates all around the country. And in fact, in every other state, it's up. And so if you've been purged from the ballot, you show up at the polls and they give you this thing called a provisional ballot, and 99% of Americans have no idea that will not be counted unless you show up at the Secretary of State's office or the county election official's office within, and this is where it varies from state to state, 48 hours to 5 days, and present, irrefutable ID that proves that you actually are a U.S. citizen, and then they might count that ballot. So, most people, I think this accounts for the redshift. People walk out of the voting place thinking that they voted, and then they tell the exit pollsters, "Yeah, I voted for the Democrat," and that's why you get 5 points of redshift, because the Republicans are purging the Democratic voters. How do we inform Americans that if you've been given a provisional ballot, you need to raise holy hell?
Yeah, and and we've talked about this on the show because of listening to folks on the show. We actually introduced a bill to directly go after the cross-check issue and try to make sure that doesn't happen again. Hopefully that's something that we can try to look at should the Democrats take Congress, because clearly those purges are done for one reason only, not for any good government, but to purge certain types of voters and make it tougher for them to vote. Specifically on the provisional question, I think we just have to get the word out where that's being used or misused. Like I said, fortunately in some places, but I think we're the exception in Wisconsin where we have same-day registration. So, people can still be able to vote. But, as you know, other states, unless you do it months in advance, you're not able to actually vote on Election Day.
Oh, yeah. The rolls are closed right now in Florida for this election. Yeah. And down 2%, really? Omar in Herndon, Virginia, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Thanks so much, Tom, for taking my call, and greeting to Mr. Pocan. In light of Chris Collins from New York charges for insider trading, I really don't think he's not the only one who does this. I think a lot of people in Congress are insider trading. They share information with other people who donate to their campaign. Is Congress going to do anything about insider trading, that these congressmen, information that they get? Tom Perez, as you remember, was trading on healthcare companies before he was passing laws on them. Is Congress going to do anything?
Yeah, I think you mean Tom Price, who got in the cabinet. Yeah, right. But you're right, Omar. I mean, first of all, there are ethics rules around it. The problem is it sounds like in some cases there is a little too much latitude. Chris Collins was just an example of someone who really abused the system in a very outward way, right? I mean, he bragged about what he was doing, got a bunch of his colleagues to also invest in the company, but then didn't tell them when the test results didn't come in, and he sold his stock. So I bet you he's got a few of his buddies not too happy with him. But bottom line is we do need to make it so that there is no question that, as a member of Congress, I meet with a lot of companies, and I know a lot of what they're up to. We have to be very careful and ethical with how you deal with that information. I mean, there's one company in particular in my district that's doing an amazing job in growing. They've got interaction with the federal government. I will not even invest in anything like that. Anything I'm going to advocate for, it's just a terrible, bad idea to do that. And fortunately, Chris Collins' arrogance allowed him to decide that he could not only invest in but be on the board of and then legally share the information that came out. And again, that's part of why our ethics rules probably would have gone after him, which is why he ditched out so quickly.
Yeah. We just have a minute to the break. Brian Barrett broke this story on this show back, it must have been more than 10 years ago. He walked into, I think it was Tom DeLay's office, and they were doing day trading in the congressman's office based on inside information regarding military contractors. He came on this program. He was horrified. He was the congressman from Washington State, and there was supposed to be some action to make it illegal. I mean, he sponsored legislation. I thought something had passed after he left Congress. What's the status of that?
Yeah, I couldn't tell you offhand from that bill because I'm not sure, from that situation. I wasn't in Congress at the time. I mean, there certainly are ethics rules. We have all sorts of reporting and other requirements. However, it is really loose because half of Congress are millionaires, right? And they treat passive income very different than active income. And, I think we absolutely should be tightening this up so there's not even any doubt that when you're advocating for someone, you're advocating because it's a company in the district. It's the right thing to advocate for, not because you're going to make a personal profit or use that information. Yeah.
Okay. I totally agree. We'll be back with more of Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls here on the Thom Hartmann Program. It's Middays with Mark. Congressman Pocan is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and it represents the state of Wisconsin. And you can find his website at pocan.house.gov.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
More of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment. Hartman University Book Club. Today we're reading from Ralph Nader's most recent book, Breaking Through Power. It's Easier Than We Think. This is from the first chapter. It's titled Plutocracy of Maximums, Democracy of Minimums. When I was a student at Princeton University, I learned from my anthropology studies that the concentration of power in the hands of a few is common to all cultures, societies, nations, tribes, cities, towns, and villages. Even where the thirst for self-governance and democracy is strong, as was the case in New England Third, wealthy Tories were there too. In central and western Massachusetts, the farmers used the term the river gods to describe the rich merchants using the Connecticut River as a possible profitable trading route. These days, most people protesting for economic justice use the term the 1% to describe the ultra-small group of people who wield enormous influence over our society today. There is something about the differences in skill, determination, lineage, avarice, and pure luck that stratifies most people from the rulers who dominate them. In the political realm, the few become dominant because they hoard wealth and are driven to exercise power over others. When a small group rules a society, the political system is considered an oligarchy. And when only money and wealth determine how a society is controlled, the political system is a plutocracy. From the standpoint of a democratic society, both oligarchy and plutocracy are inherently unjust and corrupt. Of course, there are variations in the degrees of authoritarianism and cruelty that each system exercises over the greatest amount of wealth, power, and immunity from justice for themselves. In many ways, the majority of Americans live in a democracy of minimums, while the privileged few enjoy a plutocracy of maximums. This small volume is not just about the ravages of power or the assaults against disadvantaged and downtrodden communities. The subject here is the dominating influence of the 1% in business, politics, health, education, and society as a whole. Over the past 50 years, Americans have suffered the relentless commercialization of everyday life, their privacy and their childhoods, their parks and prisons, their public budgets and foreign policy, their schools, religious institutions, their elections and governments, and the most basic societal institutions of them all, the family. Consider all the family functions that have been outsourced to business. Eating, cleaning, childcare, counseling, therapy, entertainment, sports, lawn work, simple repairs have been increasingly commercialized, commodified, packaged, and